Undulating periodization is a strategy that I like to use when designing training programs for intermediate to advanced weightlifters, or in other words, those that I'm currently working with who've taken their training extremely seriously for between 3 and 5 years. Essentially, it's a strategic manipulation of training intensity and training volume to allow for fatigue management and progressive overload, and therefore allow for specific adaptations to the current training program. Such strategic manipulation of training stimulus accounts for the principle of the supercompensation cycle, otherwise known as the SRA curve, or stimulus, recovery and adaptation curve, whereby following a period of training or training stimulus, the athlete will experience a period of fatigue, whereby recovery is essential in order for them to adapt to that training session or training block. If the intermediate or advanced weightlifter that I'm working with is being prescribed heavy loads continuously each and every training session, then it's highly likely that they are going to be subjected to copious amounts of fatigue, which will certainly result in some form of illness or potentially injury. At best, the consequence of a lifter being exposed to too hard of training too frequently will effectively result in a decay of their lifting technique. So one of the other benefits of undulating periodization is that it will allow the lifter to train as hard as possible, as frequently as possible, whilst managing fatigue to prevent the breakdown of their technique through simple manipulation of training volume and intensity. Now, the stress that an athlete or lifter is exposed to is not exercise specific. And what I mean by that is a very heavy clean session will potentially affect a heavy snatch session the following day or even 48 hours later, down to neural or nervous system fatigue. Careful manipulation of sets, reps and training intensity on a daily and weekly basis will allow the lifter to train as hard as possible, as heavy as possible, without resulting in injury, illness and technical breakdown. This method will also help me predict when a lifter is more likely to be able to train hard and heavy. This is not only important for times of competition, but it's also important when I'm establishing where I want their training bias to be in order to help develop their weaknesses and technical errors. So the graph that I've drawn on the board here is going to illustrate an ideal situation. Follow the athlete being exposed to an effective and strategically placed undulating periodized weightlifting program. On the horizontal axis here we have time, and along the vertical axis here we have performance. And this horizontal line here represents the athlete's base level of performance. So once the athlete has been exposed to a particular training stimulus or training stress, there is undoubtedly going to be a particular level of fatigue and therefore a decline in performance. Following effective and strategically placed recovery, the athlete is then going to recover and adapt and therefore see an improvement in their performance. Now, should the next bout of training stimulus or training stress be exposed or prescribed to the athlete at the right time, then the following stages of fatigue, recovery and adaptation will occur, so much so that the athlete will see a gradual improvement in performance over the medium to long term. The following graph illustrates what I tend to see in most beginners, in most people who chase the weights constantly without following an effective training program. So here we have the same horizontal and vertical axes, only in this case what we see is that once the athlete is exposed to the training stress or stimulus and they experience the undoubtedly level of fatigue and recovery, what we're doing here is we are prescribing or exposing the athlete to a training stress or training stimulus too early, too soon. And what we're seeing over time is that the athlete is not able to recover and adapt to the previous training stimulus long enough, over enough of a period of time, in order to see improvements in performance. In fact, what we see here is that the athlete is going to see a decay in their performance. And this is what I was getting at earlier on in the video, where they may experience some form of breakdown in their technique perhaps, or worst case scenario, they're going to experience illness or injury. Best case scenario, they're going to experience a decay in their technical breakdown, or at worst, they're going to feel extremely unmotivated because they just don't have the energy nor motivation to train hard as frequently as what they believe they should. Now again, as I said earlier, fatigue or stress following a stimulus is not exercise specific. So the stress or stimulus identified here in an intermediate lifter may not be snatch sessions or clean sessions. This could be Monday heavy snatch. This could be Tuesday heavy cleans. Or alternatively, this may be as a result of following a really difficult squat strength program interspersed within the weightlifting sessions, which effectively is preventing the athlete to recover adequately in order to see improvements in performance. So if we take a look at an example undulating periodization cycle, or in this case, this is an example of one of my intermediate lifters' hypertrophy blocks, whereby during the hypertrophy exercises such as squats and pulls, they're going to be focusing on lifting between 60 and 75% of their 1 repetition maximum. And in that case, it's going to be 6 to 12 reps. With the Olympic lifts and their more complex derivatives, then in that case, it's going to be somewhere between 3 and 6 repetitions. So what you can see here along the horizontal axis is time. In this case, that is a period of 4 weeks. Along the vertical axis, it is the impact on the stimulus, recovery, and adaptation curve. So as you can see at the moment, it looks pretty complicated. However, if we do break it down into individual exercises, it's actually pretty simple. So first of all, if we look at the snatch, which as you can see in the key is labeled with a blue line. Starting over here on Monday, this athlete is going to be prescribed a medium session. So in that case, it could be somewhere around about 70% of 1 repetition maximum and between around about 4 to 5 repetitions. Now, following this period, then the athlete is going to be prescribed with a low session, and in that case it could be 60 to 65% of 1 rep max and with 3 to 4 repetitions. This is then followed by a medium session, but as you can see, it's slightly harder than the previous medium session, which covers one of the scientific principles of progressive overload. This medium session is then followed by a high, medium, low, medium, high. So you can see here that with the snatch over the period of 4 weeks, what we are doing here is prescribing the athlete to lift as hard as possible, as frequently as possible, but each hard or medium training session is followed by a lower, lighter, easier training session to allow them to recover and adapt to the previous training stimulus. So if we now introduce the jerk into the training program, which in this case is illustrated by the green line, you can see how it follows a very similar loading pattern to the snatch, whereby a medium or high session is immediately followed by a low session to allow the athlete to adequately recover and adapt to the previous training stimulus. Now the difference here is that whereby the snatch is performed on a Monday and a Friday, the jerk is performed on a Tuesday and a Saturday. And this order isn't by chance, it's been done strategically. And effectively that's down to the fact that every lifter is going to be capable of jerking more than they can snatch. So it doesn't make sense to place a jerk session the day before or even 48 hours before a heavy snatch session, because it's highly likely that their shoulders are going to be extremely fatigued, and due to the greater load performed in the jerk, it's also more likely that they are going to be more neurally fatigued as a result. If you remember a comment that I said earlier on in this video, the fatigue or stress an athlete has been exposed to is not exercise specific. So it's very important that regardless of the loading parameters, we need to consider the order in which exercises are performed. Now, the loading parameters of the clean are somewhat different. If we focus first our attention on the red line, you can see here how with the clean I'm only prescribing this once per week, and that's ultimately down to the fact that the clean is much more taxing, much more stressful on the nervous system than both the jerk and the snatch. So in this case, the loading parameters still follow a similar principle in that a high session will be followed by an easier session, and the higher session next time round is slightly harder than the previous high session, again accounting for the scientific principle of progressive overload. You can see here how we are cleaning on Thursday of week 1, followed by Thursday of week 2. We have a high session on Thursday of week 3, followed by a medium session on Thursday of week 4. Now, my only concern here, having only cleaned once per week, is that there's a very, very good chance that whilst the athlete will be very, very capable of recovering between these sessions, it's highly likely that their technique is likely to break down. They're likely to experience technical decay due to the lack of frequency that the athlete is exposed to for this exercise. So here in this pink magenta line here, you can see how I've prescribed cleans again, but this time it's on a Tuesday. But these sessions are of a very low impact here. So this is not going to stress the athlete's nervous system enough to warrant recovery, but it's going to allow the athlete to practice their technique so that they don't experience any breakdown in their technical ability. If we now piece all of this together, where now you can see the loading parameters of the clean in both the red and the magenta line, and compare that to that of the snatch and jerk in the green and blue line, you can see how it all now comes together as a training program. One thing I like to point out to you is the inverse relationship between the clean and that of the snatch and the jerk, whereby you can see here that whenever there is a high or medium, which are relatively difficult clean training sessions, there are strategically placed medium and low snatch and jerk sessions. And again, this is done strategically, it's done on purpose to ensure that the athlete is capable of recovering enough in between high and medium sessions so that they don't experience any bout of illness, fatigue, injury, technical breakdown, or lack of energy to perform at such a high level. Last but not least, we have the loading parameters of squats. And these squats can be anything from front squats, back squats, belt squats, safety bar squats, any squats for that matter. The loading parameters follow a very similar principle in that a high session is immediately followed by a lower intensity or lower volume training session to allow the athlete to recover between stimulus. The only difference here is that, in my opinion, in a weightlifter's program, squats are there merely as a tool to develop leg strength for weightlifting. They are not one of the competition lifts. So whilst there is certainly a lot of focus on squats to help the athlete develop leg strength, it is certainly not the focus. So my focus is not on solely back squats, my focus is not on solely the improvement of front squats, but I also include other variations of front squats to ensure that the lifter can develop their leg strength without it impacting negatively on their improvements in performance in the competition lifts. If we return to the original slide, whereby here you can see the entire program, you can see now how there are squats interspersed within the entire training program. And in this case, we have a high squat day here on the same day as a medium snatch. Whereas here we have a high squat day a matter of 48 hours following a high clean session. Now there's a very good chance here that these squat sessions are going to impact on the athlete's performance on the snatch, clean and jerk. But it's important for us to still keep these exercises in to help develop the leg strength of the weightlifters. Now it's important to remember that this is a hypertrophy block, and with squats here we're going to be somewhere between 60 and 75% of the lifter's 1 repetition maximum. somewhere between 6 and 12 repetitions. Now in this case, that's going to leave the athlete more sore than they are neurally fatigued. This type of training is going to leave the athlete with muscle soreness in comparison to that lethargy feeling that you experience following nervous system fatigue. However, one strategy that I use to ensure that the squats don't impact on the lifter's performance of the snatch, clean and jerk is by using a variation of squats. What I mean by that is on this day here, so for example week 1 on Monday, whilst it may be a high session, I've got to consider the impact that the heavy back squats or heavy front squats will have on the medium jerks the following day. So in this case, what I may do is either use the safety bar or get the lifter to perform belt squats, whereby in that case we can unload the lifter's spine or unload the lifter's shoulders to ensure that that then doesn't impact on the lifter's performance the following day. Now, whilst the structure of these loading parameters look fairly complicated, I'm pretty sure now that having broken them down during each exercise, it's much easier now to understand the layout and the reasons why they've been strategically placed as such. It's very important to remember that this is just a structure. Exercise selection, number of repetitions, and the percentage between the range that has been prescribed is going to be manipulated somewhat to ensure that the lifter does not become fatigued. And this is going to be individual specific. This is going to be based on trial and error through receiving feedback from the athlete. There is going to be an element of daily undulating periodization, having used a number of assessments every single training session to determine the athlete's fatigue status. This might be in the case of measuring the athlete's vertical jump. It may be in the case of assessing the athlete's bar velocity during squats. It may also be the result of a subjective questionnaire that the athlete completes upon arrival to the weightlifting club. The information that I receive back from those questionnaires, those assessments, those tools, could ultimately influence a change in their program, because it may highlight that the athlete is a little bit more fatigued than I potentially predicted, having followed the schedule and structure that I've previously prescribed. In the event that the athlete's vertical jump or bar velocity, or even their subjective questionnaire, highlights to me that they may be somewhat fatigued, especially in comparison to what I'd previously predicted, then there's a very good chance that I may have to reshuffle their training structure slightly and allow for a period of deload, whereby I will reduce the training volume and training intensity significantly in order to allow for the athlete to recover. This here has been illustrated in this graph, as you can see here in week 4, whereby all the exercises, including the snatch, the clean, the technical clean session, the jerk and the squat, have all been significantly reduced in order to allow the athlete to recover. This is more likely to be experienced by an advanced lifter, a lifter who is lifting very, very heavy numbers, who may be competing to a relatively high level. Alternatively, an intermediate lifter may also experience this, who is exposed to a number of external stresses, perhaps who has a very busy work schedule, who has to work full-time outside of their training, perhaps somebody who is exposed to a period of, should we say, psychological stress, whether that be financial, maybe problems at home. All of these factors may influence a lifter's fatigue, and should those assessment tools highlight to me that they are fatigued, then this is a very simple structure, a very simple reshuffle of those loading parameters that will help the athlete recover. If you'd like more information on the design of weightlifting training programs, or alternatively you'd like to receive your very own training program, whether that be working with us online or in person at Cheshire Barbell, then visit www.cheshirebarbell.co.uk. Alternatively, like, follow and connect with us on one of our social media sites such as YouTube, Instagram or Facebook.